At Harvard, a Danish scientist, Lena Howe, had the idea of using a condensate to slow down light.
We all have this sense, light is something that nothing goes faster than light in vacuum. And if somehow we could use this system to get light down to, to a human level, I thought that was just absolutely fascinating.
Lena Howe created a cigar-shaped Bose-Einstein condensate to carry out her experiment. She fired a light pulse into the cloud. The speed of light is around 186,000 miles per second, but when the pulse hits the condensate, it slows down to the speed of a bicycle.
So light pulse might start out being 1 to 2 miles long in free space. It goes into our medium. And since the front edge enters first, that will slow down. The back edge is still in free space. That'll catch up, and that'll create that compression. And it'll end up being compressed from 1 to 2 miles down to 0.001 micron, or even smaller than that. You could say, well, gee, it's easy to stop light because I could just set a laser beam into a wall and I would stop it. Well, the problem is you lose the information because it turns into heat. You can never get that information back. In our case, when we stop it, the information is not lost because that's stored in the medium. And then when we have time to revive it, the system has all the information to revive the light pulse and it can move on.
One day, ultra-cold atoms will probably be used to store and even process information.
All right. So what got said here? The scientist decides, she says, that if it were possible to slow down light, you could humanize it. You could, in fact, talk to it, as the engineer later says, and it can talk back to you. Further, and specific in the experiment, the medium that they created is the coldest thing known to us in the universe. It's colder than deep space. Now, the reason that this is significant to bring up at the beginning of our discussion about Augustine is that in the dialogue on free choice of the will, one of the major matters that's being discussed are the different types of freedom. And basically, what's being contended is that there are 3 types of freedom. One is physical freedom, which is fairly straightforward. Just think about being imprisoned physically and being free physically. Then there's another kind of freedom, which is called metaphysical freedom. Now, this is the freedom that we discussed last week at the event, especially in the form of Schiller's poem Nania, or the funeral dirge, because that's what it says at the beginning of the poem. Even the beautiful must die. And this is also the subject of Schiller's essay on the sublime. And if it's the case that you must die, then man is not free. That is to say, if there's anything that people must do, this is how Schiller poses the problem, then you can't say that there is an absolute quality to freedom. You would have to say that finally and fundamentally, human life is determined, and it's determined by universal law that it cannot break, it cannot change. And therefore, man is fundamentally not free. So although it can be said that he has free will, finally, the truth is that the universe determines human behavior, especially as it is seen in the form of death. That's the second form of freedom, metaphysical freedom. The issue is, does that exist or does it not exist? And there's a great debate about that, and that's gone on for a long time. Augustine says the answer is yes, but basically people like Bertrand Russell and Klein and other people like that all say no, because there is a deterministic universe. And even if we determine that the universe is indeterminate, it still has laws that, because we can't comprehend them, may be impinging upon, certainly in our fact that we don't know what they are, they impinge upon our ability, obviously, to control them. Therefore, man is not, is determined, at least by what he does not know. Then there's a third idea of freedom called autonomy. And this is basically, there's a particular way that Augustine talks about that kind of freedom, and he calls that, just to get to the quote here, the sort of freedom that people have in mind when they think they are free because they have no human masters, or that people desire when they want to be set free by their masters. Autonomy. Now this is a sort of important element, and I want to spend a moment on this, because this is generally what people are referring to when they talk about freedom. And a commentator on Augustine writes this: for many later philosophers, autonomy has been crucially important. As a moral, rather than a political or social concept, autonomy is a cornerstone of the very influential views of the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. According to Kant, morality requires that the agent be completely autonomous. To be a grown-up, morally speaking, means being your own boss. It means giving yourself the law by which you govern your actions, rather than accepting that law from other people or from your desires. And then he says this, commentator.
Excuse me, could you read that again?
Yeah. It means giving up the law by which you govern, means giving yourself the law by which you govern your actions, rather than accepting that law from other people or from your desires. And there's a reason for that, straightforward, right? If you feel impelled, for example, if you're a drug addict, well, what you want is driving you. So why is that freedom to follow that? You feel compelled to take the drug. You say, I'm free to take the drug. Oh yeah, really? Are you free to not take it? Apparently not. Now, but this commentator has an interesting next sentence, and I want to take this up because it's crucial to what we're going to go through in the dialogue. Augustine, however, would point out that if you are your own boss, you are also your own slave. If you are your own master, then you are your own slave. Obviously, because there's master slaves. Oh, sorry about that. Master slaves. If you have a master, you must have a slave. So if you are the source of law, and if the way that you understand lawfulness is that you only look to that which is equal to yourself, then you will be enslaved. And this is exactly what happened in the French Revolution. Some people know that Kant is often described as the philosopher of the French Revolution. Now, this is sort of an interesting thing to take up at another time, but his Critique of Pure Reason was a document at the end of this 18th century which was said to have been sort of the cornerstone of the Enlightenment, and was that which overthrew religion, theology, and the concept of a universe that was ordered by God, a non-mechanical universe. Of course, now Newton is sort of talked about as being the architect of that in physics, but in philosophy, it's Kant, it's Immanuel Kant. We're not going to take up Kant because that's not what the class is about, nor do we need to take that up with respect to the issue of free will right now. I just want to cite that because where the problem comes up is if you talk about the autonomy of the individual. And this is, of course, what we get all the time from libertarians, for example. That the issue should be that there should be complete liberalism on matters of social, personal preference. But there should be conservatism with respect to particularly governments, where government should be conceded as little power as possible. So, for example, on questions of taxation, on questions of large-scale social programs, social policy, and so forth, these are not things that should be encouraged. That government is best which governs least. And it must be left to the individual to decide his or her behavior. So, for example, in the case of the radical libertarian, he states, or she states, that not only should you not criminalize drug usage, but you should legalize all forms of drug usage. And because the reason you have to do that is because unless you do that, you have placed restrictions on individual freedom, and there should be no restrictions on individual freedom. That's basically the way that the radical libertarian will state his proposition of the issue of freedom. And we're taking this up because the issue here of so-called metaphysical freedom is the one that we're going to be spending some time on. Now, we did do some work, we did a good deal of work actually on section 2 of Augustine before, but I'm going to return to section 2 for a moment to take up something that occurs in that section. Now, what the discussion had been, that we had discussed before, was that if free will exists, why does God allow that, since that means that man can do evil? And we're not going to try to recap the argument that we went through last time in detail, but rather we're going to go to the conclusion of that argument. And that was that Augustine argued that unless man was free to do evil, he was not free to do good. That if, in other words, free will did not exist, then the things that he did which were good were not done because of his will, they were done because he had no choice. So that would mean they were not good, they were simply natural. That for something to be good, it must be chosen by the individual, by the human being. And that the difference is that in animals just do what they do because that's their nature. So if man only did what he should do, whether that were good or evil, by nature, merely, he would simply be, or she would simply be an animal. Free will is what causes the human being to be human. And that the concept of freedom does not mean that you have to do evil. But the propensity, or rather the capacity to commit an action other than the good is essential to the existence of free will. Now, Augustine therefore says, however, since God is not only perfect, but is self-perfecting, then God does not do evil. If evil is happening, you're doing that. Because God's nature is to be perfect, or to perfect him, herself, the force in the universe which follows that which is best. So if you do something that is not best for you, that's you doing that. God cannot be the source of evil because there's no interest that God has in doing that which is against his conscious, deliberate nature. If you do that, then you suffer the consequences because that's what you did. And you cannot attribute evil to God. Now, the reason that people don't like that conclusion is because it reveals why they don't want to be free. Let me repeat this. This is something that Erich Fromm talked about a lot. He wasn't that greatest guy, but at the time of the Frankfurt School back in the 1930s and 40s, he talked about the issue of why people prefer totalitarian dictatorships. Because this was obviously noticeable during the period of the 1920s and 1930s, because there were millions of people signing up for these things. As you also have in today's contemporary America. Tens of millions of people sign up for totalitarianism every day, as you see. Because the truth is that freedom frightens most people. Being free requires not merely being responsible to know, but it requires that one know the difference between freedom and slavery. And the only way you can actually know that difference is that you have to make not merely the physical universe, but the idea of apprehending the physical universe the subject of what you think about. Now, how's this done? Well, this is now the question of the nature of physics, what we call physics. This brings us also to why, in the case of a person like Johannes Kepler, for Kepler, there's no difference between physics and theology. That the idea of knowing the thoughts in the mind of God, as Einstein said, is not different than knowing the thoughts in the mind of nature, which is the mind of God. Now, this engineer, the nerd engineer, partially in being provocative, but he was also right, says, when's the last time you talked to an atom? Have you ever tried to have a conversation with an atom? Now, is that merely a metaphor? Well, it is a metaphor, and that is exactly the point. Metaphor is essential, is a physical property of the universe of man. Metaphor is a property of a physical universe of man. Now, for those of you who are trying to pretend that you are confused by what I'm saying, I simply say to you that I am, of course, attempting to deeply offend most of what you purport to believe, because you prefer to never think about who you are. I may not be doing the best job of it, but that is what I'm doing, and your anger about it is because it is a different way or a different level of responsibility than that which you would prefer to have about human identity. What the Danish scientist, a little bit more interestingly, said was, she said, well, see, you can stop a beam of light just by running it into a wall. But if you do that, then it turns into heat. So you don't really know anything about it. But what if I can create a medium, so sort of a sodium condensate, which is so cold that when the light runs into it, the light can't get hot. Now, if I can do that, then I can slow the light down from 186,000 miles a second to 15 miles an hour. And by the way, it can go slower. In an interview that I heard with her, she said we can get down to 7 or 8 miles an hour. She said, in fact, we can even stop it from moving. And then she said, and we can put it in a bottle.
What?
And we can then store it, and later on, we can have that light from 2014, in 2025, we can take it out of the bottle. Now, what is she saying? What is she proposing? This is exciting because something that you are accustomed to thinking about as a limit 186,000 miles a second. You've heard this, and then funny things happen when you approach the speed of light and so forth. So that you are sort of in the habit of at least perceiving this as being some upward boundary to human thought. Instead, she's suggesting, well, if light is physical, then I can do things with it, and I can change my relationship to it. As she said, it can be approached by humans. And of course, now they were talking about computerization and computer uses of it and different ways in which you can store information using light. I mean, that's what the engineers, of course, were getting into with the whole thing. They were really not sort of so interested, at least in the little thing we saw, in the theological implications of this, so to speak. Or ontological. I'll use the word ontological because it's an easier concept, and I think perhaps more appropriate for what we're going to talk about here. Now, when Augustine in his dialogue is talking to this young man, Evodius, they're always talking back and forth. And what's happening is that the young man is trying to agree with Augustine, and Augustine is basically saying to him, well, you know, you're really saying that you are believing things that I don't really know that we've actually proven. And one of those is about the existence of God. So the young man is just continually talking about the idea it's stupid to deny the existence of God, and Augustine is saying, well, I might agree with you about that, but if you haven't proven that God exists, then it's difficult to know for anybody else to know that any of our arguments are true. And so Augustine is saying you've got to prove the existence of God by reason. Now, if you remember the last time I did this class, I used one particular proof for that. But what I want to do here is take a passage from section 2 where this discussion reaches a certain point. And in taking this up, let me say something about what they're talking about. They're talking about the idea, well, okay, there are objects like stones, and then there are animals, and then there are human beings. So there are inanimate objects, there are living things, there are non-living things, there are living things, and then there's the human mind. And so Augustine says this, he says, so a nature that has existence, for example, like a stone, but not life or understanding, is inferior to a nature that has both existence and life, but not understanding. Let's say an animal. Like the souls of animals, he says. And such a thing is in turn inferior to something that has all three. Like the rational mind of a human being, which both exists, lives, and understands that. Now he says this, given that, do you think you can find anything in us that is anything that is part of our human nature more excellent than understanding? And they go back and forth on this a bit. Can you think of anything in human nature more exalted than reason? And the young man says, no, I can't. I can't think that there's any other quality in a human being that can exceed our ability to understand life and nature. So then Augustine says, what if we could find something that you were certain not only exists, but is more excellent than our reason? Would you hesitate to say that this thing, whatever it is God? So then the young man says, well, even if I found something better than the best part of my nature, I would not immediately say that that was God. What I call God is not that to which my reason is inferior, but that to which nothing is superior. Okay, so I'm not going to just say, if I find something that's better than me, I'm not going to automatically say that that's God. I'd have to know that whatever that being was, nothing could be greater than that being. And Augustine says, well, you're quite right, for God has enabled your reason to think so. But if you found nothing above our reason except what is eternal and unchangeable, Would you hesitate to call that God? For you know that material objects are changeable. It's obvious that the life by which the body is animated changes from one condition to another, such as aging. And reason itself is clearly changeable. Sometimes it strives for the truth and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it attains the truth and sometimes it doesn't. So his point is, all things are changeable that we know. Certainly life and certainly reason. As anybody knows who thinks about their own lives and what's happened to them in their lives. So for example, when people talk about the founders of the Declaration of Independence, I think we took this up last time, we pointed out that the criticism of these people that they were slave masters, or they were whatever else they are, whoremongers, or drunkards, or whatever else they may have been, is irrelevant to their establishment of the Declaration of Independence. It's irrelevant because the whole idea was to establish something that was more perfect than themselves. Because that's what human beings do. So that when you attempt to make the argument that flawed human beings cannot create that which is more perfect than themselves, you are a traitor to the human race. If you are making the argument that flawed people who did something greater than themselves could not have done that because they were flawed, then you have denied the nature of reason in the human being, which, yes, is changeable, but is changeable in two ways, right? It's changeable downward and changeable upward. And what's happened is that there is a perfectibility in mankind, which in the case of the Declaration of Independence of the United States, reached its height in human history. So it is irrelevant that that person who is not capable, or rather not capable, is flawed relative to their own statements about what should or should not be done. That's irrelevant to what the quality or character is of what they have both not only stated in the case of the Declaration of Independence, but established in the case of the United States. Now this is crucial because this is also the way to understand truthfully an Abraham Lincoln, a Franklin Roosevelt, a John Kennedy, or any other individuals. That is, in contrast, many like to engage in personality worship on the founders. Also, there are those who denigrate the founders completely, and then there's those who basically emulate, just sort of expostulate. Yeah, they admire, or they sort of turn it into hero worship. They idolize the founders. They create them as icons. They were not that. Lincoln was not that. Lincoln had a distinct, clear, racialist opposition to black people that he expressed in the fourth of his debates in 1858. It's there, you can read it. He changed that view in the course of 1861 to 1864. And in specific, he changed that view because of his encounters with Frederick Douglass. It is significant to state this because if you don't state this, not only do you not understand what Lincoln actually did and why it was so revolutionary at the time, you fail to also understand precisely how the United States population also changed in that same way. And in specific, in the debates concerning the 13th Amendment, this was very much in evidence. See, this was one of the reasons that Thaddeus Stevens, who thought of himself as being superior to Lincoln in his opposition to slavery, because personally, Thaddeus Stevens was completely anti-racist his entire life, could never have actually succeeded in implementing the 13th Amendment. He succeeded in collaboration with Lincoln, this was true. But Thaddeus Stevens could never have led the United States to that transformation. Lincoln could. because Lincoln's conception of the United States as a republic caused Lincoln, as you can see in the second inaugural address, to point out that no one thought that the object of the conflict, slavery, would be abolished before the conflict. That just never even occurred to anybody. So Lincoln's approach to the preservation of the Union was so powerful that that very thing that people like Thaddeus Stevens or others, worse, far worse, like Horace Greeley and some of these other characters, right? The abolitionists of Boston, who wanted to secede from the Union because of their self-righteous opposition to slavery, many of whom, by the way, were also personally racists. But they were opposed to slavery, and they were willing to secede from the Union, thus destroying the United States, which Lincoln would not allow, and Douglas would not allow. Both of them opposed that. See, the object that they claimed that they wanted to eliminate was eliminated by Lincoln before the end of the conflict. So whereas their argument was, we must destroy the Union, eliminate the Union to eliminate slavery. And then they said, well, Lincoln, you're merely preserving the Union and therefore you won't abolish slavery. Lincoln actually abolishes slavery before the conflict is over. Not because he was attempting to do that, as he said. That was never his intent. But that's what happened. Now, Lincoln was personally opposed to slavery from as early as we can ever document. But his point was, he was also what? His adherence to the American system, seen in his having begun the Transcontinental Railroad project in 1861. The very beginning of his presidency, the Transcontinental Railroad was already going, which was in part a legacy of, or the reflection of his adherence to the view of John Quincy Adams, he served in the Congress with the last, Adams died on the floor of the Congress and during the term that Lincoln served. And Lincoln, I believe, is one of the pallbearers for that. If it's not, yeah, I think that's right. But in any case, Lincoln was there when John Quincy Adams served. And so Lincoln is the continuity, I would argue, from the American Revolution, from the time of the founders through Quincy Adams, who of course is the son of John Adams and is in the American Revolution as a young man, as a spy, in specific, at the French court. And then extends and maintains the continuity of the revolution until he dies on the floor of Congress. And in specific, in the battle against slavery. Because Quincy Adams understands that the issue of slavery is not a racial issue. Quincy Adams understands that the issue of slavery is an issue of metaphysical freedom. The issue of slavery goes to the center of the understanding of the notion of the founders, of the idea of freedom as stated in the sentences of the Declaration. And therefore he, Quincy Adams, both in terms of what he did with respect to the Monroe Doctrine and his idea of the expansion of the United States westward, and his defense in the Amistad Affair specifically, as well as in his constant introduction of the petitions against slavery into the Congress, understands that what he is doing is perfecting what was already in the Constitution, what was already in the Declaration of Independence, and what was in the Revolution, the American Revolution, that his father, John Adams, and others had fought for the entire time. So Lincoln's prosecution of the war is an action on behalf of a character of freedom, which Augustine is referring to here when he talks about this idea that the There is a form of freedom which, yes, apprehends reason, but reason is mutable. Reason is changeable. And in the case of Lincoln, what he did, and this, of course, is what you see in the debates, not just the debates with Douglas, but I mean the debates during the period of the 13th Amendment discussions, and also you can see it written in his letters, that what he is doing is he is evolving a higher conception of freedom by changing his tactics as he goes through that war. For example, Lincoln in 1862 proposed that blacks should go to Panama and Colombia, and that there should be a mass migration of blacks to Panama and Colombia, and he met with a group of ministers to discuss that. And they took great umbrage at that, which startled him. He actually didn't understand it, and he said, I don't understand why a group of people who have been treated the way you have been treated will want to stay with the people that treated them that way. The response to Lincoln was, it's our country. So we're not staying here with the people that we don't like. We're staying here because this is our country. In other words, you see, there was a certain way in which one has to understand the quality or character of the African American of that period who was both literate and free, and the African American who wasn't, but as Frederick Douglass demonstrated, could express this quality. And Lincoln, when he heard this, shifted. Then there was also the case of Lincoln's discussions with Cassius Marcellus Clay from Kentucky, the abolitionist from Kentucky, who was also the ambassador to Russia, who had been in discussion with the Russian Tsar Alexander II at the point that Russia freed the serfs. And Lincoln and Cassius Clay figured out, okay, wait a minute, we can do something. We can propose that we will compensate with reparations any state of the South that rejoins the Union. We will pay you for your slaves. And slavery will, in other words, if you come back into the Union, see, slavery is going to be made illegal in the states of the South in rebellion against the United States, because you're in rebellion against the United States. Now, if you aren't in rebellion against the United States, we're not going to say it's illegal. We will compensate you for your contraband. That was what the name was for black people who were slaves, contraband. We will compensate you. We will pay for all this. We will give you reparations for your slaves. Not the slaves' reparations, give you reparations. That's what he proposed. So, you know, the Southerners are looking at this and saying, no. Because some people are sort of considering it initially and they say, no. So, and that's what Lincoln had proposed in September of 1862, which was just after he had had these meetings with these black ministers. When this didn't get accepted, on January 1st, 1863, that's when the Emancipation Proclamation got declared, which made Frederick Douglass very happy, because Douglass knew exactly what he was going to do, which is to go out and start to recruit all these black people, males, to serve in the army, which of course Lincoln heartily encouraged. And that's how that happened. But what I'm trying to indicate here is that if you read revisionist tracts about Lincoln, these things are pointed out to say how Lincoln was a racist, or that Lincoln really wasn't trying to stop slavery, or some other thing, completely contradictory to Lincoln's involvement in figuring out how you actualize the concept of freedom. Here, physical freedom, but also a form of metaphysical freedom because this freedom has to be in the context of and contained within the container of the Constitution of the United States and the preservation of, and matter of fact, the perfecting of the Union of the United States. So you can't just talk about autonomy. You take a bunch of people and you just give them another state or something. They're autonomous. There's a whole lot of black people in Panama. And we'll recognize that state, won't be part of the United States, except maybe it can apply to be a state in the United States. Which is sort of more along the lines of the way that the Russians tended to handle these sorts of things. Not very good thing. It's called the national question. This is another discussion. And is a significant difference between Russia and the United States. So this is important to our consideration for today. Now what I want to say about this issue of what Augustine raises on this matter of something more perfect than reason. What we did last time was we referred briefly to the idea of geometry and number. So now let's come back to what we started with and then say something about what you've otherwise heard. If you heard Dennis Small last night in particular, you may know what I'm referring to. Dennis went through at a certain point the various transformations that had happened over the last week. I'm only going to refer here to the very first part of what he says. He said, let's just quickly tick off and run through some of the developments that occurred over the course of this week. And you might begin to get an inkling of why Mr. LaRouche is saying there is a global sea change underway. First of all, at the APEC meeting, Asian Pacific Economic Conference, China announced an additional $40 billion fund for the new Silk Road, available for all the countries participating in it. Number two, China announced that they would be tripling their direct foreign investment abroad up through the year 2020. That's only 6 years from now, to bring the total to $1.25 trillion. In other words, they're investing in other countries as well. Number three, at the ASEAN meeting, which followed a day or two after the APEC meeting, China announced that they were providing another $20 billion for the new Silk Road. This time for ASEAN and related nations. Number four, China and Russia announced at the APEC meeting a second major gas pipeline deal. They had previously announced the largest gas pipeline deal in history. This is now a second one. They announced also cooperation around controlling flooding in the Amur River and a hydroelectric project related to that. And they also announced that they were discussing cooperation on space travel, and in particular, the Chinese invited the Russian cosmonauts to visit the space station, which the Chinese are in the process of developing. And the Russians, in turn, invited the Chinese taikonauts up to the International Space Station. A little problem here, however, which is that since the United States under Obama refuses to have anything to do with China, Chinese taikonauts will not be able to go to the American part of the International Space Station. So they are segregated from the American station. So Obama has set up a Americans only sign over part of the space station.
Well, the Berlin airline.
Yeah, Berlin airline, yeah, you could. But I like the idea of segregation. See, then that's what you have. But since the United States under Obama has also destroyed any ability to get up there or get back, we're simply writing ourselves out of what the forefront of scientific knowledge of humanity is up until we get Obama out of the White House. Now, I'm going to stop there because it is a perfect illustration of why we are proud to say what we say about Barack Obama. We don't just say it. We're proud to say it. And you have to understand that image of the U.S. segregating the space station from little yellow people is a profound one if you particularly know the history of the Chinese in America. Now, we're not going to take a lot of time on that right now, but if you really want to see a really, really miserable racial history, look at the treatment of the Chinese in America 100 years ago. And you're just dealing with something of the Transcontinental Railroad. That's famous, right? That they took the Chinese workmen off the railroad so they could take pictures of it. You rub up on this? That's actually true. But they did the thing where they linked everybody up. They took all the Chinese who were working on it out of the pictures. So the Chinese know this. Because the one thing about the Chinese is they have this really long memory, and these things are very meaningful to them in their relationship with people. So when you meet them and you talk with them, they always talk about, you know, when you give gifts or all these other things, it's extremely important. So this issue of this collaboration that should exist, particularly in the scientific field. Let's take that last part, and now we can draw the conclusion of what we've been talking about. I'm going to take a couple things up here from what Augustine is getting at. The idea is universal principle, and he uses the idea, as we said last time, about number. Well, we're going to take it on a different level. I want to just here use my two illustrations only for a particular purpose. And for this purpose, they're a little busy, and we would have used something different. But I want to just point something out. Now, we've talked about many times this idea of the golden section. And we've talked about the idea, here's the star shape, and I think it's pretty clear here. The white, the blue, the yellow, and the green star. And you have there, you're not seeing it, it's not actually drawn here, but you have the side of a pentagon, which is what the star shape shows us, if that were seen as the sides. So it's a projection, if you will, a dodecahedron, which is what that is, projected from this object, which is called the compound of 5 cubes. There's more to say about the significance of the compound of 5 cubes, not this week, however, because it's a construction called the pentagramma mirificum, which Gauss, among others, investigated extensively. And without going into a lot about the construction right now, the reason I bring it up here is that when we're talking about Kepler, and when we're talking about Kepler's investigation of the planets, we talk about his having embedded the planets in the 5 platonic solids, and that the 12-sided solid, sphere, if you want to put it that way, equal area solid, the dodecahedron, contains within it a particular ratio called the golden section, which would be this blue, let's say, compared to that side of my hand. That ratio, and it's also seen in other ways. You can also see it between this and this. But it's a physical fact. Often it's represented by numbers, but the problem with that is that people very much get into numerology rather than thinking about the simple physical relationship called the golden section. It's a growth principle, and it's a reproduced growth principle in nature. It's a living ratio, and it indicates that life is embedded in the non-living universe. Now the importance of this is that when we talk about the idea of life embedded in the non-living, this, of course, should be obvious because that's what humanity is. Humanity is embedded in the non-living. We are in the earth, but we are not of the earth. Yes, we may have been born on the earth, but the ideas, the mind, the creativity of humanity demands that it leave Earth because it is not of the earth. Why is that? Well, precisely because humanity can conceive of acting to change physical processes that are not bounded by the gravitational field, the atmosphere, or the location of the planet Earth. As, for example, we see in this idea of the speed of light, capturing light and putting it in a bottle. Light is light years away from the Earth. Yet we can talk about the idea of slowing it down, of capturing it, and of using it. So that means we are not of the Earth. Now that implies a level of freedom that's certainly above the physical, but then there's another issue. And here's where this Schiller issue, which we talked about or we presented last week in the case of the Nania, comes in. When Leni Rubinstein gave her presentation, she said several things which might have been missed at the time. She was making the analogy between Schiller's poem Ode to Joy and the World Land Bridge. So she kept going back and forth between the Freude Schöne Gottesfunken idea and all men shall be brothers and the World Land Bridge, and was saying in her presentation that the World Land Bridge was the poem. Let me repeat that. She was saying in her presentation that the World Land Bridge was the Schiller poem. Now this is an important conception because as she talked, she also referred to the 8th letter of the aesthetic letters, in which what she was referring to, I don't have the 8th letter with me, was that Schiller is making the point there that if one is presenting through reason this concept of a noble, beautiful humanity, that humanity itself, the beauty of that concept will unfold in humanity over time. The beauty of that concept will unfold in humanity over time. That humanity will mature to match that concept. And she said, well, when I read it back in 1978, I was reading this, and I was very young. And I'm thinking, wait, what does that mean? We're revolutionaries. We're trying to make this happen now. But of course, then the issue is, what is now? That's a very interesting issue. The time that it takes you to decide, for example, if you look at a pen on a table and decide to pick it up, in the time that it takes that thought to travel and for you to pick that up, you can transmit a telegraph message from New York to Chicago. Hearing works even faster. Actually, hearing works faster than thought. You hear something, it travels at about 50 milliseconds. It actually goes right to your medulla oblongata. You'll react to what you hear before you think about it at all. Then there's this matter of the speed of light that we talked about, that the speed of light can go all the way from 186,000 miles an hour down to 15 miles an hour. We embed it in this condensate. So this issue of what a now is, or the 10-year period that it took us to rendezvous with the comet. Interesting. Comet's about 2 miles wide. I think it was traveling like at 30,000 miles an hour, something like that. It has no gravitational field to speak of, and we orbit this thing. We land on top of it. So was the 10 years a now, or was it 10 long years? One of the things that freaks out some people is the fact that since you're dealing with these 5 senses, and things have to be processed through the senses, when you see light, not merely the light in the stars, you see light in this room, by the time you actually see it, it's passed already. You're not seeing that instantaneously. You can't, because it takes a definite period of time for the, quote, information to travel through your sensory apparatus. You are never in the present. You have never experienced the present, and you never will. Now, pessimists will say, oh, that means we always live in the past. No.
Well, they do.
Yeah, right. We only live in the future. We only occupy the future. We never occupy the present. Never will. And the past is dead. You only live in the future. So this idea of freedom becomes interesting now, because if you realize that you only live in the future, the making of the future gives you complete freedom. Why? Because you are going to shape things that you will never see, that you are not required to see, to shape. You may imagine them, that's different. But you are not required to see them. Matter of fact, you're required not to shape them. Because if you rely on your senses, you can't shape them. You can extend the sensorium like we did with the ship that landed on the comet, right? So somehow we extended our sense of touch and sight and so forth all the way out there into space, and we're now out there looking at something that's very far away from us, moving, very, very small. So we have an extended sense of vision. But the imagination that created that is above any of those senses. So now we have something interesting to consider. Is it possible to think of ourselves as though we existed in some future state, which is the only state in which we can exist, in which we see humanity as perfected, in the sense of not everything is wonderful and everything is paradise? No, but rather there's a humanity that, and this is another thing Laney alluded to, is like a different species in that we are relating to one another in a completely different way. The way that Modi from India, Xi Jinping from China, Putin from Russia, and others are proposing, particularly with respect to their space programs. So suppose it were the case that, like Kennedy, we proposed and thought of this crash program, 15 years, 10 years, whichever it was, around thermonuclear fusion, for example. We've talked about that. But we thought about that as part of a space-based program, the helium-3 component and other components, along with the Mars missions and these other things. Suppose that's all that foreign policy was among the states. Suppose there were no geostrategic negotiations around oil and these other hard, filthy things.
Wars.
Yeah. Well, that's another word for geostrategic negotiation. Suppose there weren't that. What would be the freedom that would give this generation of people? So that this issue of death, which is the only real issue about the control of freedom, and it's interesting because death makes a lot of things smart, like animals, right? They normally just like only do the things they do, and they see and they hear. But the one time in which an animal is conscious of itself is when it thinks it's going to get killed. It is very conscious about putting room between whatever it's afraid of and itself. It becomes conscious of itself. So the confrontation with death makes animals conscious, self-conscious. Except it doesn't last that long. It's sort of fleeting. It's not very philosophical. It doesn't turn them into great novelists. It just means that they are aware that that entity, right, is no longer just smelling something or whatever. They got to move. They got to get out of it. And of course, the hunter also thinks the same way. So anyway, that is basically what I wanted to say about this matter. I think the only thing in conclusion just about this is when you come to humanity on this issue of death, that the human mind, as I said last time, cannot die. And it can't die because if you contain in the human mind a principle, a universal principle, which holds for the universe, like the speed of light issue and slowing it down through a condensate and bottling it, then it means that the mind is larger than the principle it contains. If the mind is larger than that principle, and that principle is eternal, in this case, Augustine uses the example of geometry in this regard. If that's what happens, then the mind cannot die because it contains these eternal truths. The example we gave the other time was simply to say, if it is the case that we understand that there are certain geometric facts that are always true in the universe and they are contained within our mind, the mind is larger than the things that it contains. And he used the example of the diameter through the center of a circle, the longest line through a circle, all other segments are smaller, and it's always true. And it's true before there was a humanity and true after there'll be a humanity. And the fact that you can know that that's true, or such things to be true, the fact that you can have such ideas in one's mind, then it means that your mind is larger than the idea contains and larger than the period of time in which that idea will be true. So for example, if we can conceive of a universe which is several billions of years long, so to speak, or old, and we can conceive of a universe that is moving instantaneously to levels of higher perfection, that's a thought within our mind. So the universe that we are conceiving of is contained within us. We are larger than it. And this is the gateway for Augustine to understanding how free will is in tune with the will of the creator of the universe. That free will is intended for us to discover the immutable laws of the universe and to change those laws that we can change, to bring them into correspondence by use of the free will with that immutable capability called the free will. Now it can also be called creativity, because creativity can only exist by the free use of the will. There's creativity that, certainly in one sense, animals and other things have. But the active transformation and perfection of the capacity to be creative, that is uniquely in the possession of human beings. And what we call God, the being of the universe, that allows that capability to exist. We personify that capability, but we are not limits of the capability. And so this idea of reason being improvable means that reason can refer to something higher than itself. And it is that universe of transformation, the universe of change, which we also call law, but it's higher law. It is that which is deathless in us. It is that universe of higher law that we change and know as change, which is deathless in us. We have a capacity as humanity that does not die. if exercised by humanity. Now, that is an experiment to be done, so to speak, but it's also a capacity that has to pre-exist the experiment. The potential for that has to be there for the experiment to even be conceived. So there you have it. There you have it. It's there. So therefore, what one has to do is to constantly, as they say, as Schiller says, upset your system. I think the way that Shelley puts it at the end of his poem, The Cloud, I can't remember the exact line, it's the very last two lines. I arise and undo it again, I think it's called, or unsomething again. The idea being that just as a cloud is constantly redone, remade, so you do with your own so-called philosophical system. The key idea is what Kuza calls negative theology, is that the perfection of man lies in his undoing the structures of thought in favor of the higher creative process of invention. Invention.
But before that, undoing
the structures of thought in favor of the creativity of higher invention. That's what you do. And that's easily understood in the case of somebody like Bach. The best way to understand most of this stuff is music. Then it's very easy to understand. Then that's just simple. Just go listen to any Bach fugue and you'll understand far better what I mean than what I said. Because that's what it does. And it's never the same. It's never the same. So that is the what we'll say about this today. Think about temperature. That things that are cold are moving more slowly than things that are hot.
Right, the molecules are moving.
Right. So what they did was create an ultra-cold medium. And they had light transmitted through it. Again, I can show that again to people who came in late and so on. You know, they can just take a look at it and you can just take a look and see what it was. So the important point is not what it looks like, it's what happens to it. See, what they're talking about is that they're slowing down the atomic particles in light.
Well, light is when an electron.
No, don't do that. Don't do that because that's not what's important about it. If you do that, then you don't understand what they actually did. See, I don't want to talk about the theory of it. I'm just talking about what they actually did.
Okay.
And we'll show it again so you can just see what it was that they actually did. Because her whole point, the scientist's point, was, what if we can actually talk to the light? That's literally what they decided they wanted to do. And instead of it being, you know, at the end of an ayahuasca ceremony, or those who know what it is, you know, you don't have to do it that way. You don't need a drug to make it up. You can actually take light and figure out ways to conform the light using the electrical as an electrical impulse. And what they're basically doing is they're changing computing doing this. Now, that's not our interest. I mean, that's nice and it's a good engineering thing to do, certainly for it. But it's a different process. Okay, and well, I only introduced it for the purpose of its effect on you and effect on others to even know that that's such things. See, these are the sorts of considerations that are proper for China, Russia, United States, and so on to be discussing. See, if you had a UN conference at the opening of the UN, if you had people getting up there like Narendra Modi and Putin and Xi Jinping and somebody from the United States, right? And they were talking about this, just think about the difference in the effect, particularly on everybody under the age of 30 all over the world. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to talk about Ebola, this or that or the other. Sure, that all needs time to be talked about. But if this were the content of the actual exchange, think about that from the standpoint of foreign policy. What would that mean? See? So while it's important to take that up, and sure, I have no problem, but just imagine that. Just try thinking about the idea that, for example, you have an agreement that the United Nations next year is going to have 5 of the best minds of every nation in the world. So we're going to have Swaziland there, Botswana's going to be there, Algeria's going to be there, you know, everybody's going to be there, right? China's there, Malaysia, they're all there. And we have this woman, Lena Dow, whatever her name was, and she's there, and she comes in, and she and a few other people. And they say, well, let me tell you what I did with light. And it's for this group of people, right? Now suppose in turn, since this is the age of the internet, you actually broadcast that. So 60 million people, students in China are seeing that, and so many people are seeing it here and there and the other, right? And they're seeing this exchange, and everybody's there from around the world, right? Over 150 nations, or something like that. And everybody gets a chance to ask questions. You run it like an 8-hour session. You run it like it's a rock concert. And people just go in and out all over the world. They're watching it, this, that, and the other.
That'll be a beautiful day.
Right. Now you get, right? Now what if you then say, okay, so, you know, we could create a program of study on this, you know, over in Libya, except we got a problem with these people, what will happen in Libya if you do that?
Transformation.
It won't stand for.
That's right. You
shooting
don't
at them.
stand for craziness if people are addressing one another at this level. Now, if we didn't already know the answer, you see, we would ask the question, well, how come nobody in the United States presidency has thought of that? But of course, the answer is so patently obvious to us all, we don't even bother. So I just want to say that much about that. Now, the meeting that we're going to have, let me say something just to go to that. So here's what it is. Next Saturday, we're going to have a meeting. Okay, and so the conception is this, November 22nd. So here's how this works, everybody. Normally, we would be talking about Kennedy. It's the anniversary of the assassination. There's a poem by Schiller called The Cranes of Ibycus, Die Kraniche de Ibycus, okay? Well, what this is this is going to be The Cranes of Kennedy, Die Kraniche de Kennedy. The poem is about a poet who's on his way to a competition. He's a well-known poet, and he's killed in the forest by robbers. And then the robbers go to the festival because they don't want to make it it's the safest place for them to be, massive crowd. Whenever the poet would travel, these cranes would always fly, well actually not always, but actually what happens is when they kill him, he cries out, but he can't defend himself because he's a poet, he is not a warrior. And he cries out to the cranes that they should avenge him. And so what happens is, when the festival occurs, in one feature of the festival, there are these very weird-looking women. and they're called the Erinyes. And they come out, and they're like a chorus, like a Greek chorus. And they are dancing around, and they're talking. And they give a poem, and in the poem they're talking about the idea of justice. Not so much retribution, what we would call nemesis, that the force of good always triumphs over the force of evil, and the evildoers are dealt with. But the way they recite it is terrifying. And so what happens is, cranes fly overhead, and one thief says to the other, see Timotheus, the cranes, the Chronisha, the Ibycus. He points up in panic because he's superstitious. These aren't necessarily the cranes of Ibycus, but that's what he thinks. And the audience says, wait a minute, why are they talking about Ibycus and cranes? What do they know about what happened? Because they know that the Ibycus is missing. And the notion is that he's dead if somebody's found that out. And so then they seize these people. Now our event is intended to be that. We are not interested in having an event in which we just get together and talk about how bad it is that Kennedy got killed, whether he got killed by 3 people, 30 people, or 400 people. You know, this doesn't help us, right? What we're going to do is we want the 28 pages released, and we're doing the event to do that. How we do it, though? Well, obviously, Bob Graham has not been able to get them released for 12 years, right? If you just try to get them released, it's not going to happen. But he's trying his best to do it. So at our event, Ramsey Clark will speak. Ray McGovern is coming back to speak. Jeff Steinberg will be there. And a couple of other people maybe. But I'm also having Jason Ross come. And I want him to take about 15 minutes there and talk about the space program. And talk about how that space program, all over the world now, is Kennedy's revenge on the people that tried to kill him. Tried to kill him. Now this is intended to create a cognitive dissonance, a friendly cognitive dissonance, in the minds of the speakers. Which is how you have to do this. Say, in the minds of the speakers. Because what happened to Ramsey Clark last week was he came in and he heard the music. And then he responded to the music. Now, I mean, Clark has seen such dastardliness in his life, you know. He's seen everything. Because he knows about all the secret stuff. Clark and others know that there are a lot of bodies buried in a lot of people's basements, and those people are still alive. And they're burying more bodies even as we speak. Right? So when they speak, they tend to be very pessimistic. Not because they're personally pessimistic, because they can't figure out how the hell they're ever going to get this across to the American people. That's what happens to them. So then they get up and they say something, and you're sitting there, and pretty soon you start crying or something, and you're feeling awful. You're, oh, man, it's never going to change it. We don't want that. Now, we got a week to do this. And I'm going to tell you right now, we need all of you going full out, full tilt. Now, who should you bring? Well, all those people that talk about 9/11, all should be there. Because what we are trying to do, we are trying to get the 28 pages. But I'm not talking to you about that because you were at the last meeting when we did that, most of you. So you know what we want to do with 28 pages. We don't know whether we're going to have anybody like Terry Strada or one of the 9/11 people. We might have them. Terry Strada couldn't make it because she had some other previous thing. That, of course, adds a tremendous element to it. Because then the people feel beholden to the families, which is what I really want to stress to you finally, and then I'm finished. The only way in America you're ever going to really change the situation politically, the big problem that goes on, unless unless people think they've got the moral high ground, they won't do anything. What does moral high ground mean? See, they've been convinced for a long time that the officials somehow are either smarter than them or too powerful or whatever. So whenever people go on anything, they're always pleading with people. That's never going to work. These people are terrible. You know that. They're awful. You know, there's some kind of criminal or other, you know? They said some kind of criminal, right? So that's never going to work. You can't go to them that way. You have to feel that you have the moral high ground. Well, since the parents and the relatives of the 9/11 victims want the pages,
Yes.
that's your moral high ground. You're doing it for the families. See, and everybody in America should believe that they have to do that. Everybody. A 7-year-old will believe that, because he's going to be thinking about the kids whose father or uncle or grandfather isn't there at Christmas. And all these people want is the truth. Now, if we can give them the gift of the truth for Christmas, I'm sure they would appreciate it. See, and a 7-year-old kid will get that. So 7-year-old kids, 8-year-old kids should be held morally accountable for the 28 pages. And if they can be held morally accountable, anybody can be held morally accountable. Certainly somebody in Congress. You know what I mean? When you know that you can, quote unquote, preach that, then you know you got a way to cause the person you're speaking to stop their usual tap dance, right? Every time you talk to people, they tap dance, right? More or less. I mean, really, if you like break it down, right? I mean, we could call it a lot. They say, well, they said this, they said, yeah, but what do they look like to you really mentally when they're doing this? It's like tap dancing, if you understand what I mean, right? Or yeah, especially Bruce, because it has certain very specific meaning, some of us. And that's what people do. They never actually even care about most of what they say to you. Right? And that's why you should, I mean, you could get mad, but you got to realize that as soon as you stop talking, they don't even care what they're saying. Right? And so what you don't want to do, you don't want to waste time getting upset about what they're saying to you. You have to create a situation in their mind where they feel terrible about the idea that like they're not going to do anything about, like 3,000 people got killed down there and all that, and you still not going to do anything, right? Even though the Congress is supposed to do this, even though the Congress is supposed to serve the American people, even though the congressmen that investigated said they want the things, you are still going to stand in the way. And then tell me you care about the Republicans. You care about this one and that one. Or you care about Obama. You're just like so. I mean, you lowest thing out here. That's how you want to lead. See, people have to have that in their mind. So what happens, that's the function of the 28 pages. The 28 pages is a tactic. See, we can't spend our time on that, if you understand. All these people out here doing nothing should be doing that. We will talk about it. We will help them get past their own immorality long enough to do something. And that's this thing with the 28 pages, right? But we want to understand, see, we're doing what we're doing. We're doing what we're doing on the economy, what we're doing on the BRICS nations, all that. The American people are sitting there doing nothing. So they should do this, because if they do this, here's what will happen. They will be obstructed by Obama and company, who were that stupid. See, these people have a kind of ultimate stupidity. You have to understand why this is so good. They will oppose this, even though this is like a simple thing. They should just release the pages. Because really, somebody's going to go down anyway. Yeah. Right? So they could just do triage. They could just decide, okay, let's just like cut a bunch of people loose. A lot of people are just going to go down. Right? They could do that. They won't do that. They won't. They will defend this. And the fact that they will defend it will kill them. The fact that they will defend that will kill them. And that is exactly how you will create the environment for an Obama to be impeached. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you telling me once that, because I haven't read it, but that Harriet Tubman said she could have saved 1,000 more They only knew they were slaves.
Right.
And I think in particular the 28 pages, you could probably say this about Ebola, but certainly the 28 pages gives a person a chance to question that about themselves, and that there's an openness to it, and so that they can act, because don't you realize what you actually are then if you're not going to do anything about it, just going to allow this to go by and seemingly pretend to live your life as it is. But I'm also getting a sense personally, and I think you could be working a post office or a school, but in my work environment, where the saner elements of people I'm around, as I listen to them more and more, there's a real fear of what they can't really identify, but there's a real sense of that everything around them. Now when the stock market rises, they're very upset about it, because they're saying, hey man, that's not real. They wouldn't have said that even 2 years ago. So that there's an ability now to introduce, primarily through the 28 pages, so that they can realize that they have indeed been immoral, and that they have a real opportunity to actually save themselves by participating.
Right.
And so that's what, because you mentioned that earlier, of the many things you talked about, it was the idea of avoiding freedom and not really embracing that, because of what that actually represents, a certain morality. So of the many things, and it just seemed to time very well what you were saying and how we build this audience. And if you could, is the music, after you respond to what I'm saying, if you care to, what can you tell us about the shaping of the music at this point? Is there a program, or?
We're going to do part of the Requiem. I don't know how much. So we'll do that. And we don't know really the rest. I'm hoping we can do Mask of the Red Death again, because I think that's useful. Because of the Arignes idea, that you have to bring something to the meeting that has that terrifying quality. So that and one other thing to say. See, so bring all the conspiracy people, bring all the others, bring the carnival, right? We want to have everybody, as many people there as what we're not trying to pack it, but we bring them all in, because they also don't get how you do this. Let me sort of give you a sense, just to say what you were saying, and then, because that's all I can say about the music right now. Okay, so let's just take what you're talking about. Well, now, the example I'll use is the one that some of you have seen, some of you who don't know this example. Kim Kardashian.
Oh, God.
And did you know I was going to go there? Okay, now check this out. Yesterday's Daily News. Now, I refused to buy it, though I could have bought it.
The Daily Blues.
Yeah, because yesterday's Daily News had her ass on the cover. Yeah, well, no, you would about 40 other men over there. No, had her ass on the cover, and it was explaining this thing that she's supposedly trying to do about breaking the internet, right? And it explains how she got her ass to stick out for the photo shoot that she did, which is the reproduction of this picture, which was done back in the 1980s. Now, here's why this is important. It's crucial. It's central. Her picture shoot is the reproduction of a 19th century incident involving a black woman from the Khoikhoi tribe who was called the Hottentot Venus, because she had this giant ass, and she was put on display continuously in France as a freak to demonstrate the fundamental physiological difference and separation between white people, black people, etc. That's what it is, okay? And it is a this was a time, let me be very clear, when black people were put on display, including in the Bronx Zoo, when an African by the name of Oda Benga was put on display, Congolese, by what'd you say? Sorry?
Is that the National Museum of History?
No, well, it was, yes, the American Museum of Natural History's head, Madison Grant, is the person that did it. There were three individuals, Madison Grant, William Temple Hornaday, and the other guy's name will come to me. Well, J.P. Morgan was on the board when they did this. Also, Teddy Roosevelt was on the board. And what they were doing was they were trying to argue what they call the zoological difference between black people and white people. Okay. I unfortunately just moved that. I had the page actually from Madison Grant's what's called The Passing of the Great Race, where he has a whole discussion of this. Now here's why I'm telling you this. So this photo shoot is a parody of the Hottentot Venus. Now Kim Kardashian is too stupid to understand what this is. What's going on is she's married to Kanye West. Now what they're doing is they're arguing that he is an animal. Kanye is also too stupid to understand this. And she's naturally married to him because what she really is she's someplace back in the gene pool is no different than this zoo freak, the Hottentot Venus. Now that's what's actually going on. Do people know this? Yeah, well the people that didn't know it.
Yeah.
And you see what's happened in America is that you are not just back to the 1950s, you are back to the 1830s in America. You're in a place, you're in a zone that has rarely been seen. I don't just mean on questions of race, I mean on various things. And so the reason people are getting the sense of what you said is because it's true. It didn't just happen, but it's sort of all coalesced, right? It's sort of coagulated and kind of, ossified around Barack Obama. He didn't really do it, but he's sort of like Richard III, otherwise known as Richard the Turd. Huh? It's sort of all of that whole War of the Roses, right, and all the evil of the War of the Roses, sort of like a cesspool, sort of coagulated into the form of Richard III. And the same thing has happened around Obama. It just all trickled into this thing called Barack Obama. Now, it was already there with Bush. Cheney more, because Cheney was sort of he just oozes that, okay? He was oozing that, that's why I get rid of him. The whole thing with the heart and all, he was like leaking it out, right? So they got Obama because at least that's like a better package for this evil that just runs through the system. They knew that the problem was that black people would probably revolt given that there's 3 million people in prison, 600,000 or 700,000 of them are black males. Half of the black male population under 30 in Wisconsin has been incarcerated, and you're reaching a point where between the lack of employment, etc., in these areas as a whole, the thing we see going on in Ferguson and these other places, this thing is just reaching an explosive thing, right? Proportion. Obama was originally not intended to do anything about that. He's just implementing the plan. That's why he's there. He really has no relationship to what I just said. But others know that this is about to happen. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to create a situation where the population at large is sort of so dragged through the dirt with no defense. And the population that might have revolted has self-degraded itself. Not because it did it, but because it has all these things going on and it's saying
nothing about it.
Right? So what happens is nobody will do anything. That's the conception. So you just move the society into an utter breakdown. Now, in this context, we and you, if you do it right, around things like the 28 pages and these other things, you will get forms of reaction that will absolutely startle you. Now, see, if you try to get it by doing it directly, you won't get it. If that is, you say, well, I'm going to go out and talk about the 28 pages, he said this, I'm going to get a good reaction. It ain't going to happen that way. Won't happen. But if you start to go out and say, you know, things are so completely degraded in this country, I'm not going to stand for this. I don't know where you are on it. Maybe this is all right with you. Now, I'll tell you one thing I'm doing, and then people will respond to you. But they will not respond to you in general about any particular thing you're doing. On the BRICS countries, they may respond. Because if they know that these things are happening and America's not part of it, they may respond. And it's our duty to talk about it because that's what our organization is for. We did all that. We are the people responsible. So we have to do it. Nobody else is going to do it. Nobody else even knows it. So for the meeting next week, here's what I need. We need to make sure, we have some people working with us. So like, we need to bring like 200 to 250 people. And we had about 100 people last week. So that would generally mean, if you guys double, about 100. I'm talking the guests. I'm not talking about our members and the this and the that, and the kids and stuff. You know, there's like 150 if you take that. But the main point I'm saying is we have to, if you all bring at least one or two other people, but I would very strongly suggest that anybody that can be caused to understand what the stakes are, especially given the killing of Kennedy and given what can be and killing of people in the mass murder of 9/11. Bring these people, because the thing that you can be certain of is that Ramsey Clark, Jeff also in this case, Jason, and even Ray McGovern in a different way, because Ray McGovern has his own, you know, he got arrested up at the 92nd Street Y at a meeting that he had gotten a ticket for, because General Petraeus was there, and Ray was going to go in and nail him. And they wouldn't even let him in the building. They just carted him off, put him in a police car. Whoa. So we're inviting him apart because of that. And of course, you know, he's CIA, you know, he's formerly, you know, a lot of things. He used to brief Reagan on a daily basis every morning. So anyway, people are going to be inspired by what they encounter. But our job is to make sure that they're not just inspired. Our job is to make sure that they understand the international implications of what New Yorkers can do if they are unified and they are focused on getting a particular result around the 28 pages, which is intended to remove Obama. That's the idea. That's what we're doing. We're not just saying we can do it. We're not hoping we can do it. We're intending to do it. We may fail to do it. But even in our failure, we're going to make something happen as a result. Okay? So that's what I say about that.